Hello, and thanks for joining us. Today, I have as my guest Dr. Christopher Ferguson. He is a psychologist who has served as a co-chair of psychology at Stetson University in Florida and is currently a professor there. He previously served as an associate professor of psychology and criminal justice at Texas A&M International University. In 2014, Dr. Ferguson was named a fellow of the American Psychological Association, or APA. He further served as president of the APA's Society for Media and Technology. And at the end of 2021, Dr. Ferguson resigned from the APA due to concerns that the organization is no longer dedicated to science and good clinical practice. Dr. Ferguson has written extensively on the effects of media, ranging from video game violence to the television series 13 Reasons Why to role-playing games. Dr. Ferguson is also a published author who has written both fiction and nonfiction, which I'm really interested to hear more about. So, Dr. Ferguson, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I came across an article you wrote on a couple different websites, and I thought it was really interesting, and I'd like to kind of get into some of your research areas. But first, can you just kind of tell us, where did your initial interest in psychology begin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It wasn't like I set out like as a kid to be a psychologist. I think I was like a rock star or something. No, it was in college. And I think there's a couple combination of just synchronicity. Essentially, part of it was I had dabbled in like a very different major at first. I think I was a computer engineering major at first, and I just was very dry, so I didn't really care for it very much. Yeah. And I probably got into psychology for the, bad reason that a fair number of our majors still get into psychology, which is that I'd seen like Silence of the Lambs and all this kind of like slasher horror, like, FBI procedural kinds of serial killer movies and TV shows. And just thought it was cool, so I didn't really have any like lofty goal necessarily. I just kind of wanted to talk about sex and violence all the time. So compared to like, taking a major in like French or math or something like that, it seemed like a much more fun direction to go in. So that's really, I mean, no real lofty, although it was the funnest major I could think of, essentially at the time, and ended up making a career out of it. So I guess it worked out all right.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what got me into it. And even up until graduate school, I was mostly doing research on, criminal populations. So I got to kind of do some of that, maybe not the chasing serial killers part of it, but at least studying violence and violent crime at any rate. So yeah, pretty good. It's worked out pretty well.
Did you ever consider like forensic psychology or?
Well, I mean, I've done some work but not like the exciting side of forensic psychology. So I haven't done like profiling or anything of that sort, but I've done work in, like I said, with criminal justice populations a lot. And most of what I did was either, doing assessments for placement in jails or other correctional facilities, or I did a lot of custody evaluations for parents also. So again, not like the sexy part of forensic psychology maybe, but actually it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. So I like doing assessments. They're kind of like puzzles, right? So that part is really for anybody thinking of going into psychology, if you don't like therapy, assessments are a very different, game. And I don't really care to do therapy with people for the most part, but I really do like doing assessments because it feels much more cognitive. There's a question, you collect data and you come up with an answer, and then you're done, you don't have to worry about what happens to the person anymore, it's someone else's problem. But so I always found them pretty, pretty interesting. And of course, you still get to see a very different side of, reality, and that we kind of have this vision, right, of families and mothers and fathers and sort of their role in bringing up kids. And then you see a lot of these, the parents who have lost custody of their kids for various reasons. And you can kind of see like a very different side of parenting. And, some of them are struggling for various reasons and maybe deserve a second chance. And others, really probably shouldn't have children for one reason or another. And, it opens your mind to the way that other people, thinking of the children in these cases, the lives that some of these kids are leading and what they have to grow up with, and, how they really are disadvantaged in some respects when they hit the real world.
Yeah. Assessment, I've definitely come to see that it's if you have a research type oriented mind, you're going to gravitate toward assessment a lot more.
Fits with it very nicely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And where did you attend grad school for psychology? Did you do PhD?
Yep. I
Yep.
did a PhD in clinical psychology, and it was at the University of Central Florida, so right here in Orlando. So I've kind of landed back more or less where I started.
Yeah.
Actually, quite literally, because actually, I'm a professor at Stetson University. That's where I got my undergraduate degree, actually.
Okay.
So very, very, very much landed back
Yeah.
kind of where I started. So and I just love Central Florida, so it's been very nice. So it's worked out
Mhm.
pretty well for me.
Cool. Yeah. And what was your like early career experience like?
Oh, that's I had a pretty distorted path. So I was kind of I don't know what the word would for it be. I sort of wandered around, I guess wastrel or something like that. In my 20s and stuff. So I got my undergraduate degree, and then took me a couple of years to get a master's degree in developmental psychology. Then again, took a couple of years off, and then went back for the PhD, kind of in my late 20s.
Oh.
So I was in my probably early 30s by the time I got the actual PhD. So there's kind of like the wasted decade of the 20s, basically.
Yeah. I'm right there
Uh,
with you.
yeah. So, I mean, but I did, I did some work like in therapy and stuff. So either I was working on some degree in psychology, or working somewhere in the field as a therapist or stuff,
Mm.
for ridiculously low amounts of money. So I guess it was all part of some sort of larger plan of whatever, although it didn't really feel like it, at the time
Yeah.
necessarily. It wasn't a plan on my part. Maybe there was divine guidance or something. I don't know. No, my early, the early stuff, like I said, was actually mostly in sort of forensics, if you will, working in jails and juvenile detention facilities, and working with those populations for the most part. It was really kind of an accident that I got involved in the video game research stuff, and it really was because I was interested in serial murder and mass homicides and stuff like that. It was really these debates around video games and mass homicide. So it really was like mass homicide was my sort of door into this video game and other media stuff.
Uh-huh.
If it hadn't been for people, probably 20 some years ago, linking video game violence to mass homicides and other acts of serious violence, then I probably never would have gotten interested much in media effects research. So that was kind of the, again, serendipity or synchronicity or whatever, just lucky accident.
Yeah.
It wasn't a plan by any means, and that's kind of how it worked out. So my interest in general is kind of like people make these grandiose claims about things, and it must be some sort of flaw in my personality. But the more sure someone seems to be about something, the less I believe them to some extent. I actually am more comfortable with ambiguity than I am with certainty. So when people say something is absolutely true, then their credibility in my eyes goes down, and I get real curious about whether there is evidence, or what the actual evidence is to, so support that. So I don't know, it makes it really difficult for me to get with the program, unfortunately, but it's resulted in a lot of sort of fun research directions for me.
Yeah, no, that I can see very much how that personality style fits in with research. Like, it reminds me of a few different things. Like, when I came into this program and I first started learning about therapy, I thought like, no, you should be sure. Like Freud was sure of his theory, or Adler was sure of his theory. And then you read someone like Jung, and he's like, well, Freud can be right and Adler can be right, and they can both be wrong in certain aspects. But yeah, that's kind of what it sounds like. It's like, you're probably missing something.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the reality is most people with advanced degrees are just as conformist as everybody else is. So there's not really necessarily a link between, sort of a PhD in the research field and, being a gadfly.
Yeah.
And there's even studies that kind of show this. I mean, if you look at like science beliefs, right? So you see everybody with these signs on their front lawns now. In this house, we believe in science, and those signs are absolute bullshit, because people that, that's only true. And so, first off, that's not how science works. It's not like the Bible. Like you just get here's science, and you just need to believe in this thing. But also, usually those folks, are really thinking of things where the science fits their worldview. And as soon as you present them with something that doesn't, fit this, and usually it's sort of like the left that had these signs up because they're trying to troll the right. So if it's sort of, something unfriendly to the left's worldview, then actual studies show that people on the left are just as confirmation bias likely. conformists, they are angry at science that it does not support leftist worldviews just as much as right-wing people are angry at science that doesn't support right-wing views. And occasionally they align, so sometimes you see like the far left and far right will align on things like video games sometimes, or pornography or whatever, where they're both upset by science for different reasons. But yeah, so I think I wanted off your question. I don't remember what your question was at this point.
That's fine. Yeah. So you got into research in video games and violence because you were interested more in the violence, and people were saying for sure video games, like especially violent video games, are it's gonna lead to violence.
Yes, that was a very common assertion, certainly 25, really beginning somewhere in the early 90s. Well, I mean, you can find actual examples of it even going back to the 80s. People were talking about like Pac-Man and the asteroids is causing stuff. Yeah. So it's not like a new thing, but really I think kind of hit a fever pitch, in the 90s, and then particularly with the Columbine massacre in 1999, that's really kind of solidified this view in the public imagination. It was very bipartisan at the time, that both Democrats and Republicans kind of viewed this as a thing. And but it was clearly a moral panic, that we see these like repetitive cycles, and it still gets dragged out of case. And I've seen some stuff, it's mostly been like on Twitter, but so it doesn't hit like the peaks that it used to anymore. But after there's just a shooting this weekend in Buffalo, and some people, and it seemed to be more on the left this time for some reason, we're talking about we need to talk about gamer culture or whatever, but there's no evidence that gamers are particularly prone to obviously, like any community, there's some bad apples, whatever, but there's no evidence that gamer communities are more alt-right or racist or anything else any more than any community is. I mean, you can find toxicity online, and like literally among young adult authors, or about knitting communities. I'm actually using real examples. I'm not making this stuff up. That you can about Google toxicity in online knitting communities, and you find all kinds of crazy like knitting. Why are people even interested, let alone having these polarized arguments about stuff? But people are jerks, and you can find jerks in any community. And what happens is, if you already kind of don't like this group, then you just look for some example of a person that they go, oh, we need to talk about games or whatever. We don't even know this guy played games. I mean, I imagine he probably did, but but that's just because he's a young male, and like 90% young males play video games at least occasionally. So it's just people use these cases to support a narrative. They really want to talk about this thing, and they'll try to look for these like extreme examples to try to get people to talk about that thing. Usually backfires, but people still think it works for some reason.
Not too long ago, I was reading up on the Columbine shooting, and I think I just read the Wikipedia page on it, and it mentioned that it explicitly mentioned like they were both into playing Doom at the time, and it's like they didn't explicitly say that was found to be a correlation, but they did talk about it,
well, you can find cases, so we get this like confirmation bias, right? So people, like if you think that video games cause violent crime, then you look for cases where the actual shooters were video gamers, like in the Columbine massacre. Then you ignore cases of like older males, or sometimes occasionally women, who are mass homicide perpetrators who don't fit the gamer profile. So it's like 2010, Amy Bishop was a 42-year-old biology professor who shot up her biology department because she didn't get tenure, right? Nobody thinks video games, but nobody talks about video games, so people just kind of forget that case, right? So same thing, like the Sandy Hook shooter in 2012, turned out he mostly played Dance Dance Revolution, right? So not usually most people's idea of a violent video game. But these cases, if you kind of like just pick, individual cases and say, haha, this mass homicide perpetrator played video games, or this one was a racist, or this one was a misogynist, and you kind of try to make mass homicides about your issue. What you're doing is you're ignoring all the other cases that don't fit that narrative, and you're kind of trying to create a correlation in people's minds where there really isn't even a correlation. So that's the unfortunate thing about like mass homicide, is people tend to, it's very politicized, right? So obviously for gun control is one thing. So everybody wants to make it, about gun control, which at least has some sort of, consistent sense to it, because guns are involved in not all, but the majority of these cases in the United States. But then, like I said, you get, like the guy this weekend was, an avowed racist. So people are going to make, well, this is about like racial extremism. You get another case where a guy will target women. So that one's about misogyny, and something else. There was a African-American gentleman who ran over a bunch of, older white ladies, but that doesn't fit the narrative, so people don't talk about like racism, and that sort of situation. So, you kind of get this sort of like, selectivity. People are picking upon these idiosyncratic elements of these different cases, and ignoring the commonality, which usually is these are antisocial, psychopaths, for one thing. And there are these injustice collectors. They tend to ruminate on, their problems. But they also tend to be chronically mentally ill, in most of these situations, either suicidally depressed or have psychosis of one sort or another. And for some reason, people downplay that, if anything, or at least advocates for the mentally ill downplay that. And that's unfortunate, because those are really the actual commonalities between all these individuals, whether they're male, female, black, white, Latino, old, young, and so on and so forth, are these three things. They're angry, they think about how people screw them over a lot, and then they tend to be mentally ill. And if you kind of focus on those commonalities, you may have some insights into how to actually fix this. But people want to make it about their political issue, which actually this part.
Yeah, I listened to some. I vary back and forth, but I listened to some right-wing political commentators, and it was about a month ago, I think, the subway shooter in New York. He was an African-American gentleman, and they said that they found out he was also like racially motivated. But no one talks about that because, like you said, it doesn't fit the narrative.
Right.
And then it makes me think of, when you said people downplay the mental health aspect, I'm pretty sure that gentleman had some mental health issues too. But I wonder how much of that is psychologists or our community trying to like normalize mental health issues. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, there are good intentions there, right? But as they say, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, I mean, the good intention, I actually agree with the intent, is to try to, we don't want people to stigmatize the mentally ill so that they're not abused, mistreated, or neglected, or things like that. And that is a legitimate issue. There's no question about that as a legitimate issue. On the other hand, you can't lie to people in advance of that. So the reality is that certain types of mental illness. Now, mental illness is very broad, so we're not talking about like spider phobia here, But if you're looking at like psychosis and certain other forms of mental illness that links between things like psychosis and violent crime, it elevates any individual's risk by about 3 to 5 times. So the chronically mentally ill are much more likely to engage in assaults than are non-chronically mentally ill. Now, the vast majority of the chronically mentally ill don't commit, violent crimes. But if you look at like the general population, it's something like 3, 4, 5%, commit violent crimes. If you look at psychotic individuals, it's like 15%, or so, maybe a little bit more. So again, we don't want to assume that everybody who has a psychotic illness is going to be a violent criminal. Most are not. But there is an elevated risk, that is important to acknowledge as well. So I think for some reason that people get into this mindset that you have to say things that aren't, or I don't know that people know that they're not true in most cases, but somehow there's been this distorting effect, that has percolated down, and people repeat these things over and over, even though the empirical evidence is not in support of them. So of course we know that people on the right do this, whether it's global warming or I don't know, vaccines, I guess, are now a thing on the right. I'm not in a lot of right-leaning spaces, to be honest. I'm in academia and tend to be, I call myself an Obama progressive. So I don't watch a lot of Tucker Carlson. I don't know what he's, anyway, we won't talk about Tucker. But you do see these things in left-leaning spaces too, but it's harder for people on the left to see it. They can see it when they catch a clip of Tucker Carlson, they go, "Oh my God, this guy's crazy." Obviously, but when they hear things on the left, like, the mentally ill are no more likely to be violent, or things like gender is a social construct, or whatever, things like that are not empirically supported, that they just keep saying it, and it picks up the sort of truthiness, to it. One of the ones I'm seeing is, student evaluation time is out. And of course, in faculty dialogue, you'll hear people say, everybody knows that student evaluations are biased against women and racial minorities. The evidence actually is not good to suggest that student evaluation. I mean, it's inconsistent. I mean, there's some studies find effects, some studies don't. And that's fair to debate. But this idea that you just sort of flatten all that uncertainty in a research field and just sort of say, everybody knows. It's like the Dothraki, right, on like Game of Thrones. It is known that, and like I said, it's fascinating. I'm fascinated by it more because I think I was naive to it maybe 10 years ago and not really seeing that for the most part. And now in the last particularly 5 years, perhaps being like, wow, like the left is actually just as purposely delusional sometimes as the right, around some of and like I said, these yard signs about science don't impress me anymore because I think people on the left just ignore science when it suits their purposes. So
yeah. What is the APA stance on video games and violence?
They don't know what they're talking about. APA is the worst. I don't know. There's a lot of so they still have a policy statement. I mean, I think if I'm steel manning it as much as possible, I think their stance would be something effective. Their perception is that there is consistent evidence. Again, I'm not saying I agree with this, but their stance is that there is consistent evidence linking video game violence to aggressive behavior, which they don't really define what they mean by that, but not to violent crime. So I think they've clarified that violent crime isn't in the picture anymore. But there some sort of nebulous aggressive behavior. There is some sort of impact, for. So that is their stance. It's a very controversial stance, because a lot of scholars still think that's incorrect. As we've had more and more studies, they're right about the violent crime part. I think finally, and it's good because they really left it pretty murky, in terms of what their perspective was up until really 2021. I think it was that they clarified finally about the violent crime. But first off, they never say what they mean by aggressive behavior. We're really talking about like putting someone's hand in a bucket of ice water. It's not, so they don't tell the public what we mean by this, but also even the experimental studies, the evidence is inconsistent. So again, I think there's a lot of concern that they are misrepresenting a research field that increasingly is pointing away from video games having an impact, even on these milder behaviors like prank level April Fool's Day aggression. That's really what we're talking about. But even doesn't appear, with newer, better quality, what we call pre-register studies, we really just aren't seeing these effects even for mild aggression. So, I don't know that, it's like anything else. Like if you're beating a drum about video games, then the APA stance is gold, as long as you don't try to apply it to violent crime. But, other than that, I don't think anybody takes it terribly seriously. Certainly I don't think scholars in the field don't even refer to it terribly often. And if they do, oftentimes it's to, point out that its stance is not consistent with everybody in the field. So they don't represent a consensus statement that most or many scholars would agree with.
Yeah, I think I saw you mentioned, I think you and 200 plus other scholars wrote an open letter to the APA asking them to change yeah,
it's a good example in the futility of open letters. Right, yeah. So about 230 roundabout scholars wrote to the APA. This is going way back when they were putting together this most recent statement, so like 2012, 2013. Basically asking the APA just to stop doing these statements because they tend to be so misleading and do more harm than anything else, really. At least in terms of like, ruining the reputation of because most people kind of know that video games don't, do this stuff anymore. But, so it looks kind of wacky. It looks like a bunch of old people. Now I'm straw manning. I was steel manning. Now I'm straw manning. But it does look kind of wacky. That they have a bunch of old people waving their cane at kids. Which I'm getting old enough at this point to start doing myself. So I don't think this statement has been good for our field. I don't think it's been good for the APA. but it's one of many statements I think the APA has been involved in that you could probably say the same thing about. So I think in general people should be a little bit wary of sort of position statements by these big science groups. They're not really science groups, they're professional guilds anyway, but
yeah, I was going to ask, when would you say that the APA, in your opinion, no longer was practicing good scientific practice?
I'm not sure they ever did.
Okay.
I don't know. So there's a history that goes back. So there's this guy. I'm gonna mangle his name because I'm terrible with names. But I think William O'Donoghue, who has this article from the 90s pointing out problems with APA policy statements. And the basic argument he has is even these statements. So basically, as long as I've been like literally alive, so going back to the 70s, that there are these highly politicized, APA statements that essentially by happy coinky-dink, they do one of two things. They either support back in the 70s would have been considered liberal causes, now would be considered progressive, or two, tend to make psychology look better than it is. So in other words, we have the answer on this issue, rather than saying our field is murky and nobody can agree, which is really what the truth is on most things, right? Because that doesn't make us look good. Saying we have discovered, this thing, it is an absolute truth, looks a lot better. So I think that has been a general trend as long as the APA has. I think there's just something corrupting about policy statements in general. So I think that they started really kind of producing them in the 70s, maybe late 60s, but 70s for sure, and they've never been good. So they kind of, generally speaking, have this sort of problem of both the political bias and also sort of like over advertising psychology, which if you think about, it's a professional guild. So that's what you would expect, is they're trying to make psychology look good. So that is going to be the bias they have, is to try to overemphasize the degree to which psychology has the answer to these sort of pressing social questions. And so I think it was always bad. I mean, like everything else, it got worse during the Trump administration, and I get it. I mean, I obviously was not a fan of Trump, but I mean, I tell the joke sometimes, like, so they would release, like, everything he would say, they would release some letter. It was just like a letter from the president of the APA for that year, just opposing whatever. The President Trump couldn't fart without the APA releasing a letter opposing it, kind of stuff. It really just got, I get it. His was a very polarizing administration, and I certainly disagreed with. I probably substantially agree with most of the letters, but. For my own personal politics, but obviously you water down your brand every time you release. If you are a scientific body and you want people to take you seriously, it behooves you, in my opinion, to say as little as possible, so that when you do say something, it really has a lot of weight to it. If you're kind of coming out and saying that the Trump administration is like the Nazis or something like that, which for all of its flaws, it was not the Nazis. Then you kind of seem partisan, first off, but also just kind of ridiculous. And even if, like I said, substantially I probably agreed with most of the positions that the APA had taken in those letters, it just was like a clown show, in the sense of, like, it just comes across as so fragile and so politicized, and like I said, I think it just waters down the brand of psychology, and certainly communicates to conservatives that were like not conservatives, which is true. But also, it's a great way of getting half the country not to listen to anything that we say, so somehow we have to restore some sense of, objectivity, at least, if not neutrality. We don't have neutrality at all, but, we can at least try to be objective, but we haven't done that very successfully.
Did you say something about attempting to change the APA from within? Or was that?
It's like, so just like an open letter, right? It's a futile endeavor, right? I mean, obviously, it's like, what's the mantra we say in psychology? The patient first has to want to change, kind of a thing, So my goal had been at one point. So I'm not really a big joiner. I guess it's probably not a surprise, So I'm not really that enthused about joining organizations and being on committees and this sort of stuff for the most part. But I did kind of think this was important. And, I became an APA member. As you mentioned, I ended up being a fellow in 2014. I sat on their Council of Representatives for 3 years, which is kind of like, if you think of like US politics, it's sort of like the House of Representatives, if you will, for so it's sort of a policy setting body, for the organization, made up of unpaid members. We get voted in for 3-year terms and this kind of stuff. And I was president of the media psychology division too. So I kind of got involved, in various ways, which I got to see how like the sausage is made, to use that cliche, a little bit, which didn't help my perception of the APA. But because it's not made it's just like the hot dog. You don't really want to know like the process that goes into making that thing, it's much more palatable when you just imagine that these things grow on trees or something, or that like there's really like a part of the body of a pig that looks like that, or so certainly it seeing how things work on the inside, probably, if anything, added to my concern about how the APA works. But I mean, that was my goal, was to try to like bring data, bring a different perspective. And I mean, and I don't want to like overplay it. I mean, there definitely were good people, in particularly on the council, and but most of them were just rank and file psychologists, and really the way to think of it is like the APA, even though it's technically a nonprofit organization, is otherwise structurally no different than a big business, like Apple or something like that, and and it's just like going into Apple and say, well, maybe we shouldn't make our parts in Western China where they're committing a genocide, and it seems kind of obvious, but nobody does anything. They still make the damn thing, in Western China through slave labor, right? Or Nike or any of these companies that, throw up Black Lives Matter squares on their Instagram, but then, profit off of slave labor in Asia or other parts of the world, with no apologies whatsoever. Disney, filming a movie, near the concentration camps, Mulan. So it was kind of like that. It's sort of like, the public, what people say in public, and sort of, their incentives for why they do things, as they run things are very different. So, and that was really, I guess what disheartened me about a lot of those interactions is really the data don't matter. It's really about what political positions are most beneficial for the organization, either in terms of like, it's like any other mob, basically placating the members, and as those members increasingly become further and further left, then just sort of mirroring the opinions of the mob, if you will, while also promoting things that are profitable, to the board of directors, the people that are sort of running the real inside machine. So there's the council representatives who just sort of, random psychologists who get voted in. They're not paid, but there also are full-time employees, who have fiefdoms. They're directors of this and, whatever, a CEO, COO. So otherwise, it's very much set up like a, corporate structure. I think the CEO makes something. I had it in an essay I'd written. I don't remember the exact number, but it is certainly at the upper range of hundreds of thousands, something like 800, 900,000, something like that. I apologize if I'm getting the exact number wrong, but it's like a lot of money, a lot more money than I absolutely make. So obviously they're going to do the things that, bring in more money. And, as an example, I'll say like in 2020, and I actually found this out, they, like a lot of organizations, were experiencing financial difficulties because of the pandemic and stuff. And so they laid off dozens of low-ranked employees, to save money. And in the same year, they gave all the high-ranked, the directors of this and CEOs raises the same year. So this is an organization that portrays itself as committed to social justice, laying off its low-ranking employees and giving raises to its high-ranking employees. That's like the worst excesses of capitalism that people that, who are legitimately socialists always complain about, right? It's just, anyway. So that's an example of just how garbage. Anyway, it was not a satisfying experience, So I will admit I failed. I absolutely failed. And maybe there was a more strategic way. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I didn't have I didn't put the sugar on the medicine as well as I should have. So I'll say I'll opt cop to my own personal weaknesses in that, but certainly was not successful in turning the aircraft carrier around in this situation.
I was gonna ask, I guess, since you mentioned earlier you don't really do much therapy. I was gonna ask if, because the APA, you have to get licensed with them, and you're to be like a licensed clinical psychologist who practices therapy, you're licensed by the APA. I've been wondering, with a lot of the political stances and people who have qualms with the APA, how many people are going to end up practicing without a license, but not, like legally,
Yeah.
but letting their license go.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
the good news is actually in the United States, we're licensed by the state, so we're not licensed by the APA. They're private, they're
oh,
APA, even though they have American in the title, they're a private nonprofit. They have nothing to do with the government. Now that makes us like, oh, well, you don't have to worry about them. No, you do have to worry about them. So there's kind of like this like interaction between the state governments and the APA. So you typically have to like graduate from a program that's APA accredited. And every 2 years you have to get continuing education credits, basically. I was going to give you the abbreviation. I wouldn't mean anything. So, and of course, a lot of those are APA accredited programs. They don't have to be. So the state can also credit certain things that are not necessarily APA accredited. So, but yeah, I mean, you don't have to be an APA member. In fact, most psychologists are not APA members, in order to practice. What I think you're kind of getting at, like, retaliate. What could the APA do to retaliate, against someone who is, I don't think too much necessarily. I don't know that, to their credit, I don't know that I've gotten the vibe that they're terribly interested in retaliation, so there have been a number of psychologists who have deeply criticized the APA. I think, for good reasons. Increasingly I'm joining their ranks, although, for different reasons maybe than some of the others have criticized them. And I don't know. I mean, I have heard some stories of retaliation, but it tends to be like shaming and reputational kinds of stuff. I don't think that I know of any cases where the APA has gone after someone's license, or something of that sort, so they'll say stuff publicly, like this person's a lunatic or whatever. So it's dismissive, reputational smearing types of stuff. But I don't know that they've tried to like make it difficult for someone to practice. The reality is the APA themselves have really limited enforcement tools, so they can only discipline APA members, and the main discipline is to, make you lose your membership, so that's it, so there's not much that you really could, so if you're not an APA member, I'm not an APA member anymore, so there's not really much they could do. I mean, I suppose if they really were, upset at something I was doing, they could file, a complaint with the state licensure board or something of that sort. And maybe because it's the APA, that would carry more weight or whatever. But to their credit, I don't want to accuse them of something they haven't done. They've done plenty of rubbish things, but I have not seen them be terribly retributive, about criticism. And now that I've said that, I'm going to get emails from psychologists who are like, no, here's what they did to me. And I do know of a couple cases, like I said, that yes, they have reputationally shamed a few people over the years. But I don't think they've gone after anybody's licenses or sued them, or like, it's not like Scientology. They don't have like PIs falling around or stuff. So, to their credit, they haven't done too much of that. But no, you don't have to be an APA member. You can largely ignore the APA. I probably will never give them a dime again, for any purpose, because even with like the CEU credits, the continuing education, that you can get providers that are non-APA, just as long as the state certifies them, then that's fine. So it's not that difficult to do. So you basically have to deal with the state,
Okay.
Not the APA directly,
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of things that the state has are influenced by the APA. So like you think of like ethics codes, right? Every state has its ethics codes. They may vary a little bit from state to state, but largely they're based on the APA's ethics codes.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I was under the impression that, although I was aware you had to get licensed by the state, I was under the impression that it was through the APA, kind of.
No, but the graduate programs are what is it? What's the word for it? Basically certified, but it's not it. Accredited. There we go. Accredited by the APA. So if you go to a graduate program that's not APA accredited, you're kind of screwed. There may be some ways you can work around it, but certainly gonna be a lot more difficult than if you just go to an APA credit program. But now that I've done that, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So
yeah, good. What are some other, so I mentioned in your bio, you study violence in video games. You sort of written some about 13 Reasons Why, the television series.
yeah.
What are some other, what has been kind of a very interesting area of research that you've been a part in that you maybe favor or that you find most intriguing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love the video game stuff. I did it for 20 years. I mean, at this point, I don't know that there's a lot more to do, in that area. We're doing a study now looking at sort of like racial representation in games and if that impacts aggression towards people of different, basically same stew by a different name, I guess, kind of thing. They're basically still video game violence studies, but just sort of throwing a racial, component into that. Basically, that do video games make people racist? The answer is probably no, but but it's interesting to see empirically one way or the other. I may eat my words if finally getting a statistically significant result on one of these things. I don't know. But in general, I mean, I've been interested in these kind of like moral panics and in media. So most of these things tend not to work out. For the most part, I've been getting involved in some of that's why I've alluded to it a couple times. I now have sort of a new paradigm looking at sort of like concerns about like race and policing and violent crime and that sort of stuff too. And once again, that seems to be an area where people's perception isn't matched by reality to some extent. And again, there's a wide range between being like the Star Trek racial utopia versus 1955 Jim Crow, right? So you don't have to believe everything's like 100% beautiful, to think that things are much better than they were during the Jim Crow era. But it looks like for the most part, people, again, primarily on the left in this case, are exaggerating at very least the sort of like systemic elements of racism, so some of the studies we've been doing tends to find that like things like mental health or class issues tend to impact police misconduct much more than does race, for instance, or that we're doing a meta-analysis now of the sentencing disparities, and that for the most part, the U.S. justice system is pretty egalitarian. There are, for like violent crime or property crime, there don't appear to be any racial disparities in sentencing. For drug crimes, there are a little bit, but they're very small, much smaller than most. Like we're talking about like, impacting maybe somewhere between like 1% to 4% of the variance of people sentencing or something like that. So relatively small, but they're there, So which makes an argument, maybe we ought to reconsider like the war on drugs or something. So there probably are some reasonable things we should change there. But again, I think when people hear about like racial disparities in sentencing, they're thinking it's all crimes and that they're massive, the white dude is getting probation where the black or Latino dude is getting 10 years. And it's not, it's something like, if it was a 10-year sentence, we're talking about maybe like, 10 to 30 days difference between the white and the black defendant or the white and Latino defendant. Asian defendants actually come out better.
Really?
So it's not much, but they actually get slightly smaller sentences than anybody else. So which also doesn't quite fit the narrative about sort of white supremacy and that kind of stuff. But anyway, so I think the stuff is interesting, both, and I think, I actually kind of like these messy pictures, where, because I think that sounds more true if you kind of say like, for the most part, the U.S. system actually is much more egalitarian than people assume, but there may be a few little areas here that still need a bit of tweaking. I think that that seems pretty fair to me, and it's data based, right? So that I think is important. So that's sort of the new stuff that we're working on. Of course, the more politically correct side of it also is we kind of look at like the commission of violent crime, right? So if you kind of look at that, certain racial minorities are overrepresented in the perpetration of violent crime, including the murder of police officers, right? And that tends to mirror, if you look at like police shootings, that obviously there are disparities in police shootings where, black and to a lesser extent Latino men are shot more often by police officers. So those numbers kind of mirror each other, right? So there's an overrepresentation in the commission of violent crime, and there's this overrepresentation in terms of being shot by police. And obviously, these are related. I mean, this shouldn't be, but that's very controversial for me to say because people lose their minds. But it actually is, obviously these things are somehow coordinating with each other. And so if you say as we have shown in some of our work, that, well, it's not really so much race that's actually, even though there's these sort of numbers and disparities, when you boil it down, it's really not race, but class and mental health. So a low SES, mentally ill white guy gets treated by the police more or less the same way as a low SES mentally ill black guy. But the reality is it's these class issues that are resulting in police misconduct. The good news for the sort of the progressive narrative is that's true for violent crime perpetration as well. So if we kind of say, well, lower income black or Latino guys, are overrepresented as perpetrators of crime, it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with their social circumstances, their neighborhood environment, and again, things like mental health and everything else. So once again, that low SES mentally ill white dude is just as likely to commit a violent crime as is that low SES so that's the politically correct side of it. So it takes away the racist argument that certain races are more or less prone to violent crime. That's not true at all. It is really the individuals who are in difficult social circumstances are both more likely to be exposed to police misconduct, and probably the reason they're being exposed to police misconduct is because the cops are scared, because they're more likely to engage in, which doesn't mean that the cops are doing the right thing, by the way, So it really suggests that if we're kind of like thinking in policy, right? If you focus in on race, you end up with this sort of thing that divides, right? We're going to give a bunch of stuff to this group because we like them. We're going to ignore these people because they vote for Trump, right? On the other hand, if you focus in on class, it lifts everybody up and doesn't leave anybody behind, right? Maybe this group over here is going to get more of those benefits because they were experiencing more of the disparities or whatever, but you're not leaving this group over here out who are going to now become resentful because nobody's interested in them, right? So it's just a different way of framing policy and how to fix this. Maybe, and I actually do be very clear, I advocate for certain changes to the criminal justice system. I think we have very draconian punishments for particularly drug crimes and stuff like that. So I would love to see some reform of the CJ system, but you have to figure out how to do it strategically, right? And if you divide people, it makes it harder to move your policy forward, as we've seen over the last 2 years, right? We've made no progress whatsoever on criminal justice reform, even though there was this initial burst of, most people after the George Floyd murder supported it, and there was an opportunity there, even if we kind of say, well, maybe George Floyd was killed because he was mentally ill or, lower socioeconomic status, not necessarily because he was black. Who cares, right? If that still moves us in the direction of sort of, fixing some of these problems with police training, with, how, police profile low-income neighborhoods, whatever, the war on drugs, whatever it is that we want to look at, how do you get everybody in the rowboat together moving forward, versus how do you divide people and make everybody angry and with like Twitter, kind of stuff, then we've got down the second road, right? And people get so married to their ideological, moral narratives that they can't see beyond them. And if you sort of raise any objection to them, then you're become a fascist or a communist or a racist or, all the other bad words that we now call everybody at the drop of a hat, and it really actually shuts down any progress, which is exactly what we've seen over the last 2 years. I'm not happy that we haven't made, we have an embarrassing number of incarcerated individuals. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the developed world. It might be anywhere. I can't remember actually, but certainly in the developed world, certainly even compared to places like, I think like China, maybe, comes close to us or something, but it's really an embarrassment. A lot of that is due to just these, it's sort of not that easy to get into contact with the criminal justice system, but once you do, the punishments are draconian. So the 3 strikes and you're out, all this kind of stuff, mandatory minimum sentencing, all that sort of stuff makes it really, once you're in for good, kind of a thing, or it's very difficult to get back out again. And that's something we need to fix.
Yeah, I'm taking a forensics class this summer, and we were just talking about, for instance, with drugs, data shows that when people get out of prison, they go back to using drugs again. Like, prison doesn't rehabilitate them. And then so they go back to using, and then they get put back in prison, and it's just a cycle. And it's just, and then they have this thing called drug court. I don't know if you've, so there's a lot of different areas that could be improved upon.
Yeah. Well, what happened is too is it was kind of this. I know we've sort of strayed into criminal justice talk, and that's okay because that overlaps with a lot of stuff I do. There was this kind of movement in the late '90s and into the early 2000s that really was emphasizing a lot more of that sort of mental health court, drug court, training police officers to deal with crisis intervention, so they didn't shoot everybody. There really was this kind of like movement in the direction of trying to like community policing, things like that, where the beat cops would get out there and actually talk to people in the community, so they were part of the community. Really a lot of really good initiatives. And then of course 9/11 happened, and then that really just transformed everybody's mind into every cop needs to be ready for a nuclear weapon to go off in every city. So every police department has to have an armored personnel carrier. All these cops need to be alert for terror. And granted, some of that made some sense, given that we have some new challenges, but I think like really hyped up, people's perception of what cops should be doing, and of course cops' own perception of what they should be doing. And a lot of the training then became the sort of sense of like there's a war going on, and cops are part of this war. And whether it's terrorism or just regular criminals with guns or whatever else, every time you step out in the street there's guns everywhere, everybody's a suspect, you need to be ready to there really was this training. It was sort of like much more aggressive, officers were trained to be much more aggressive. And I think now 20 years down we're sort of dealing with some of the consequences of that sort of overly aggressive policing. So even though I criticize progressives as sort of having a false narrative around sort of like some of the race issues around policing, they're not wrong in a broader sense the sense of like police officers are oftentimes ill-equipped in their training to deal with a psychotic individual who's having a crisis. There's a one case of and it did happen to be an African-American gentleman, but there was a fellow, I can't remember his name because I'm bad at names, as I mentioned, who had like, it was in a drive-through lane, I think it was in Atlanta, and he fell asleep. And basically what broke down is the cop showed up and said, you can't park your car, and go to bed in a drive-through lane at a restaurant, and then presumably this gentleman was mentally ill, so he resisted the officers. I think he grabbed one of their tasers or something like that. So he actively resisted the officers, which, granted, is a good way to get shot, whether you're white or black or male or female, that's not. That shouldn't be controversial to say, we should try to convince people not to resist police officers. But of course, if you have schizophrenia, right, it's hard not to. You don't know what's going on necessarily. And I think the officers in this case, I don't know specifically what their training was like, just to be very clear, but I think this is kind of the problem with police training in general, is officers don't really know how to approach this individual who may be unable to respond to police requests. For the average individual, you start shouting at me and waving a gun in my face, I'll do what you want. I'll do what you want. So for 95% of people, that really hyper aggressive approach can work. It's the 5% who, or not 5%, it's really like less than 1% who has schizophrenia or psychosis, who they're going to escalate in that situation. So how do you train police officers to identify, okay, this guy parked and went to bed in a drive-through, he might have mental illness. That's not normal. So how can we approach this guy and just keep it smooth and calm? We don't want to start waving guns in his face or threatening to, but how can we get him, one, to move his vehicle, and two, maybe get him the help that he needs? And that's a whole other issue about mental health services in the United States. But so maybe there isn't a way to do that, But then that's where I think police officers are not, on average, terribly well equipped with their training. They've been trained to approach everything hyper aggressive, and that works in a lot of situations, but it doesn't work in that situation. So I think that's why people are sort of saying we should bring social workers in, because social workers will be better able to deal with this. Is a nuisance call. This guy's not threatening anybody. Can we just bring in someone who can talk to this dude and see if he needs some help? Make sure he's not gonna flip out. This kind of situation, which maybe cops aren't terribly well equipped to do that. Now, you actually could train cops to do that. But that just hasn't been where the training has been in the last couple of decades, unfortunately. Again, back 20 years ago, there were some initiatives heading towards that. Kind of went away after 9/11.
With you might not have a whole lot to say about this, but I believe with that recent shooting that just took place the other day there in New York, I believe that the young man had been evaluated prior, And he was evaluated and I guess passed, but he was still on the radar, but he's still, so what do you have to say about for people who want to commit mass violence, but are able to pass a psychological examination?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so you end up with these kind of questions about constitutional rights, and obviously the shooting in Buffalo just happened a couple of days ago, so the information at this point is going to be pretty unreliable. It's going to take us a while for you to sort it out. And I've kind of followed it, but I haven't followed it super deeply, so I don't want to speak out of turn about this particular individual too much. But in general, yeah, I mean, the criteria for getting this is a whole debate about gun control, right? That. The criteria for getting a firearm in the United States is very low, right? And there are situations where, you can be red flagged and, or if you're a previous felon or whatever else, if you've been involved in domestic, there's a few situations where you can red flag people for background checks, and that sort of situation. But the reality is actually it is quite easy, but you get into this kind of question, right? I see both sides. I make everybody pissed off when I say I see both sides, I see both sides of this sort of thing. And that you kind of get into this weird, like Minority Report sort of issue. It's like, can you evaluate people and predict their future behavior? And can you do a psychological evaluation and basically say, yeah, I don't know, this person is like, if you're familiar with the MMPI, like they're 4 and 9, right? The antisocial and the impulsivity are kind of high, and this person maybe this isn't the sort of person you want to have a firearm because they're going to get angry and impulsively whip it out.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm actually kind of okay with that, in the sense of I would probably, I would probably support something that would require some kind of evaluation, but I also understand the sort of the right, when they talk about like it is the Second Amendment, it's a constitutional right, it's in there for a reason. It is the sort of situation I can see where it could be very easily abused by the government because, where's the cutoff? Even if you talk about people who are, again, inside baseball, high 4'9", but, are basically antisocial, impulsive individuals. There's a bazillion of them. They're everywhere. They're in academia. I can tell you they're in academia. They're humanities professors, There are lots of people have that profile that are otherwise law-abiding citizens, So you're going to take someone who's never done anything wrong, who just has a nasty jerk personality, and you're going to deprive them of their constitutional right. I mean, I get it. It makes me a little nervous. I hear what they're saying, it's a tough issue, right? So, and what people will point to is, because the left will say, well, we don't need these firearms anymore. And people on the right will say, well, look at Ukraine right now. The reason why the Russians having a tough time in Ukraine, everybody's got an AK-47 over there, so they're shooting at them from windows and stuff, all right. I mean, yeah, I get your point. I don't think Canada's going to invade us anytime soon, but, but I get it. I get their argument, so with a lot of these things, we are talking about gun control, or of course, abortion is in the news with Roe v. Wade, or the whole J.K. Rowling versus trans activists, all these like really weird, like culture war things. I mean, the thing that strikes me when I think of it is if you could find 10 rational people on either side of this, put them in, feed them and water them, but otherwise it'd be like, what is it, the conclave in Rome when they elect a new pope, they have to put the smoke up through the chimney when they come to I think you could, most of these issues, you could find compromises, if you have people who are willing to work it through in a database, sort of way. I mean, there's got to be some sort of meaningful compromise where, all right, maybe some kind of test for people to, own a firearm. Not going to be a big one, but it should be something, just like we have for motor vehicles. Of course, it's not constant. There's no amendment in the Constitution for cars, so fair enough. It's not a one-to-one, contrast. Same thing with like trans rights. I mean, there's got to be some sort of, I understand it's a murky issue, I don't know. I mean, with the trans women in sports thing, I don't know what to do. I mean, because obviously it's a sticky issue in terms of, I get it. People are going to be disappointed one way or the other, so how do you figure out some sort of way of working this out in a sensible way? But the problem is that all the narrative around all these issues is sort of the space is occupied by people who have very extreme views. on either end. So
Uh-huh.
you look at, like, I've been sort of involved in the debates about like critical race theory in schools,
Uh-huh.
and so you have on the left, people will have this narrative that's really weird. It basically goes to effective, and I am straw manning a little bit, but in fairness, but like, we're not teaching CRT in schools, but if we are, it's really good.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of the narrative that's coming across. It's like, what? It sounds so dishonest, and it is, because people are using CRT in schools. They absolutely are. It's anecdotal. We don't know how prevalent it is, so I would like to see more data on it. This idea that we'd have never, it has no influence. No, of course of course there are schools that are there. You can look at people in the teachers unions advocating for more CRT.
Yeah.
Well documented that CRT is influencing at least some schools, without hard numbers about how prevalent it is. And then, so you have those people that are just like, come on, just say it, or acknowledge there are at least a few incidences of what schools have done, that they've done horrible things that are probably harmful to kids. There was one example of like a school that told a biracial kid that one of his parents probably was abusing the other one because one was white and one was black or something like that. I mean, we can all agree that's bad, right? I think you should be able to say like these things, maybe they're anecdotal, maybe they're rare, but schools should not do this, right? But they can't. They just can't. They just can't say that. It's all like, it's the Fox News effect. There's actually a Fox News fallacy. I don't know if you heard of that. Like, people on the left assume that if something is on Fox News, that it must be false. But then you have people on the right, it's like, let's ban everything. We'll ban Martin Luther King, books about pregnant seahorses. It's just like, oh my God, this whole debate is so irrational. Like, people on both sides have lost their minds. And it's funny to watch some of these things. Like, because I live in Florida and we have this DeSantis and the parental rights and education bill. And just, I mean, so I've read it, and I mean, there are reasonable critiques of it. I don't think it's I think it's addressing, at least anecdotally, a real problem. But I don't know that its approach to addressing it is highly effective. And I think there are legitimate concerns where some of the vagueness, it doesn't say you can't say gay, but I can understand where a teacher will be like, I don't know, can I talk about going with my husband to kayaking over the weekend? It doesn't really, it's more or less vague, which is chilling, right? So it's a legitimate free speech issue still, that something is unclear, it still can chill speech. It doesn't say you can't talk about your husband, but it doesn't say you can either. So that's why it's vague, so you get, but you get this like back and forth with Disney getting involved, and like, the New York Times will say like Disney employees are in an uproar over this. And you look at how many people protest, it was like 60, in Burbank, so obviously there's not a consensus among, and it's just both sides will go back and forth. And then like the governor of Texas will send like the Department of, I don't know, of Corrections, no, not the Department of Corrections, but anyway, whoever it is, I think it's like Child Protective Services, after like kids who are trans and their parents, if they're, it's just, people just lost their minds. And it's interesting to watch like how one side will do something crazy. So like there have been anecdotes, and so I'm trying to be clear, where some schools have allowed books in that are pretty close to porn, into mostly high schools, but still that are pretty bad. I mean, I would, even as a pretty, absolute free speech defender, like, no, I get why parents would not like this. Yeah, I get it. It's not just that they're talking about like gay couples or whatever, like someone's giving another person a blowjob in a picture, so I hope that's okay to say in your,
it's okay.
Like, I get it. I get why this probably shouldn't be in schools. And then like, I don't know, Texas will like ban Martin Luther King or something like that. Like, oh my God. Like each side just gets crazier, like, or the groomer thing, on the right. It's like, come on. I mean, teachers are making some bad decisions. I'm with you, but pedophile, they're all pedophiles. No, that's unhinged. And it's just fascinating to watch like the sink to the bottom, and how each side just gets nuttier and nuttier. And the problem for progressives, and as someone like myself who mostly would like to live in the progressive world, is that crazy is the right's home turf. And so we're now seeing the first time really in my life. Now, people, when I say this, some people say, well, what about like in the 2000s, there were like these anti-gay amendments. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, occasionally the right has, managed to sort of whip up some support for some, I think, pretty crazy stuff. But I've never really seen the right win culture war stuff before, and they are now. I mean, like, like I kind of agree with some of the stuff that they're saying. Like the left is really blowing it. They're really taking this really extreme illiberal. They're not concerned about free speech anymore. They're not concerned about due process anymore. They sound a lot like the right,
Mm.
And it's like, I don't know. I mean, if that's it, then if you're saying you want like a book with a blowjob in high schools, I don't know if I'm with you on this one. I don't want this like censorship regime either, but I'm sort of stuck. I normally would have been on your side.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
I've heard of people say, I didn't leave the left left me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was that Elon Musk sent that cartoon out, that was sort of like shows like the left getting further and further left. But I mean, in fairness, the right has gotten further and further right too. So I think that's why people fairly criticize that particular cartoon. Yeah, the right is way right of what like Reagan, or George H.W. Bush at very least, So there definitely has been this rightward lurch on the right, but the sensible again, I always think in terms of strategy. I mean, the sensible thing on the left would have been to stay in your ground, reinforce your values around free speech, which were historically a left issue, and due process. As part of the interest in criminal justice reform is due process. Whereas the right wants to throw everybody in prison. Stick to those. Yeah, but we don't do that anymore. We don't do free speech anymore. Free speech is harmful. It's white supremacy. No, it's not. No, it is not. Free speech benefits minority communities, however you define minority, more than anybody else. And if you want to think about, like, if you're endorsing the end of free speech or restrictions on free speech, look who's about to take charge in 2022 and 2024, most likely. Do you want to really set that precedent of arguing that free speech is bad just before your opponents come into power? That's stupid. I'm starting to sound like Bill Maher now. Really stupid strategy, and it's unbelievable that people on the left have fallen for this stuff. But anyway, it's just, that's
very interesting. To take a turn, so you have authored a few books, both fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
Did you start off self-publishing? Did you get a publisher? What was that like?
No, I got real publishers, which is like super hard to do, unfortunately. I mean, to this point, I'm thinking like maybe I should self-publish. It'd be so much easier. And such, but no, I did the whole thing. Got an agent in, pitched these books to, real, they're all smaller publishers, so they're not like, Random House or Scholastic or things like that. But, so I'm still not, I'm chipping away at Stephen King's empire, but I'm not really there yet. No, they're all on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and places like that. So, it's still the version of being a rock star, right? Is too lazy really to be a rock star. But I can sit at home and write books. That doesn't require much physical energy for the most part. And of course, the hope is that people will actually read them. So
what's one of the favorite ones you've written?
I would say at this point, probably certainly in nonfiction would be How Madness Shaped History. So. So I love history, and in another life I probably would have been a history professor. But so basically, it's the intersection of psychology and history, and it makes the argument that people matter, kind of a thing, because it's been like a trend in history, kind of focused on like the environment and resources and viruses and this kind of stuff, which is important. But as we can see from like the Trump presidency, for instance, or Zelensky in Ukraine, right? Individuals do sometimes matter, for the course of history. And in this book, I prefer to talk more about like the crazy people, the extreme cases of like people that have screwed things up for their societies in big ways due to their mental health problems. So it was a lot of fun to write. I write it to be kind of fun, so it's not. I mean, it's pretty well. I would like to think it's pretty well sourced, but I write it to have fun, and there's lots of jokes in it and this sort of stuff. So if you're squeamish about like serial murder and then a joke, might not be like the best book for you. If you really are like, again, need a trigger warning or something like that, no, this isn't. But if you really are have like this morbid curiosity and maybe a little bit of a morbid sense of humor to go along with it, probably is a good match. But I talk a lot about serious stuff, about like mental health history, mental health systems, all that kind of stuff as well. But I would wrap that in with a bunch of serial killers and maniacal despots and all kinds of other stuff, Caligula, like crazy people from history that like just were horrible human beings. So that was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, I'll link it in the description for this video.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Great.
Help put my kid through college.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, that's about our time. Yeah, it was really interesting. I want to thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It was this was a lot of fun. I appreciate you thinking of me, and this is great being on.
Oh, good.